You ever ignore a game because reviews said it's average or not worth it? And then later, you try it and realize you almost missed something amazing? It happens way more than people admit. Some games get judged too early, some get compared to the wrong things, and some just don't click with critics at all. But once you actually sit down and play them, they hit completely different. And that's exactly what we're getting into today. So yeah, this isn't your usual list of top-rated games. This is about those underrated titles that didn't get the love they deserved at launch, but ended up becoming hidden gems for players who gave them a real chance. Some of these had rough starts, some were misunderstood, and some just flew under the radar. But every single one of them has something that makes it worth your time. Let's start with a game that perfectly shows how wrong first impressions can be. There's something about surviving in a world that feels completely against you, and that's where Days Gone really shines. Critics mostly called it repetitive and buggy when it launched, and yeah, early on those issues were real, but that's not the full picture. Once you get into the rhythm of riding your bike through empty roads, managing fuel, and constantly preparing for danger, it starts to feel immersive in a way most open-world games don't. Those freaker hordes alone completely change the experience. One moment you're exploring quietly, and the next, you're being chased by hundreds of enemies at once, trying to think fast and survive. What surprised me the most, though, is how the story grows on you. It starts slow, but Deacon's journey becomes way more emotional than critics gave it credit for. It's one of those games that aged incredibly well, and if you play it now, it feels like a completely different experience. If you're into raw, gritty survival where every upgrade actually matters, then Mad Max is one of those games that deserved way more credit than it got. Critics mostly labeled it as repetitive and a typical open-world checklist, but that really undersells what it does right. The moment you start building your car piece by piece, it becomes way more than just transportation. It's your lifeline. Every upgrade changes how it handles, how it fights, and how confident you feel out in the wasteland. And that vehicle combat? It's easily one of the most satisfying parts of the game. Chasing enemies across the desert, smashing into them, ripping parts off mid-fight. It feels chaotic in the best way. Even outside the car, the combat has that heavy, impactful feel that makes every hit count. What really sticks, though, is the atmosphere. The world feels empty, but not in a boring way. It feels harsh, lonely, and dangerous, like survival actually means something. Critics focused on repetition, but when the core gameplay loop is this fun and immersive, it never really feels like a chore. Not every game needs to be massive or complex to leave an impact, and that's exactly where Ryse Son of Rome got misunderstood. Critics mostly brushed it off as a shallow experience that focused too much on visuals, but that really misses what it's trying to do. The moment you step into the battlefield, there's this cinematic intensity that pulls you in. Combat might seem simple at first, but once you get into the flow of timing your attacks, blocking at the right moment, and chaining those brutal executions, it becomes surprisingly satisfying. And yeah, those executions are flashy, but they actually add to the feeling of being in the middle of a brutal Roman war. What really stands out, though, is the presentation. The scale of battles, the way scenes transition almost like a movie, and the emotional weight behind Marius's journey all come together in a way that feels focused and immersive. Critics called it repetitive and lacking depth, but in reality, it's a tight, cinematic experience that knows exactly what it wants to be and delivers on that vision. Sometimes a game gets judged for what it isn't, instead of what it actually tries to be, and that's exactly what happened with The Order, 1886. Critics focused heavily on its short length and cinematic style, calling it more of a movie than a game, but if you go in with the right expectations, it delivers a really unique experience. From the start, that alternate history London pulls you in with its dark, detailed atmosphere. Everything feels carefully crafted, from the environments to the characters to the tone of the story. The gameplay is slower and more deliberate compared to typical shooters, which actually fits the setting. Gunfights feel grounded, and those unique weapons add just enough variety to keep things interesting. What really stands out, though, is the storytelling. The performances, the pacing, and the mystery all build together in a way that keeps you invested. Critics saw limitations, but in reality, it's a focused cinematic journey that prioritizes immersion over scale. And that's exactly why it works.
Street clear. There are more in the courtyard.
If you've ever wanted a horror game that actually makes you feel helpless instead of powerful, then Alien. Isolation is exactly that kind of experience. Critics at the time said it dragged on too long and felt repetitive, but honestly, that slow burn is what makes it so intense. This isn't a game where you fight back and dominate, you survive, and sometimes barely. The xenomorph isn't just following a pattern either, it adapts, it learns, and it constantly keeps you on edge. One moment you think you've figured things out, and the next you're hiding in a locker, holding your breath, hoping it doesn't notice you. That unpredictability is what makes every encounter feel real. The atmosphere also deserves a lot of credit. The retro sci-fi design, the sound of distant footsteps, the flickering lights, it all works together to create this constant tension that never really lets go. Critics focused on its pacing, but in reality, that drawn-out fear is exactly what makes it one of the most immersive horror experiences out there. And yeah, from here on, things start getting even more interesting. Some games don't fully click until you stop playing them like a normal shooter, and that's exactly what happened with Prey. Critics at launch said it felt slow and a bit confusing, but that's really because it doesn't guide you in a typical way. The moment you start experimenting instead of rushing, everything opens up. You're not just fighting enemies, you're solving problems in creative ways. Maybe you turn into a random object to sneak past danger, maybe you use the environment to set traps, or maybe you go all in with upgraded abilities. That freedom completely changes how the game feels, and then there's the atmosphere. Talos. It has this quiet, isolated vibe where you're constantly second-guessing what's real, especially when literally anything could be a mimic. It keeps you tense even when nothing is happening. Critics focused on the pacing, but in reality, that slower build is what makes the experience so rewarding. Once it clicks, it's one of those games that sticks with you long after you finish it.
A tool that has a lot of different uses. Alien abilities called Mimic.
So in the game, you can actually learn your powers from the aliens, so it's only fair.
Sometimes a game gets judged more for its unfinished feeling than for what it actually does right, and that's exactly what happened with Deus Ex, Mankind Divided. Critics pointed out that the story ends too abruptly and feels incomplete, which is fair, but that overshadowed how incredible the gameplay really is. The moment you start exploring Prague, you realize how detailed and layered everything is. Every area feels like a puzzle with multiple ways to approach it. You can sneak through vents, hack security systems, talk your way out of trouble, or just go full combat if you want. That freedom makes you feel smart, like the game is actually rewarding your choices. And then there are the augmentations, which let you shape your playstyle however you like, adding even more depth to every situation. Critics focused on what was missing, but in reality, what's here is polished, immersive, and incredibly satisfying if you enjoy games that respect player choice. And trust me, we're just getting into some seriously underrated territory from here. At first glance, this one can feel like just another fantasy RPG, but the longer you stick with it, the more it starts to stand out in ways most games don't even try. That's exactly what happened with Dragon's Dogma. Critics back then pointed out its rough edges, from uneven storytelling to limited fast travel, and those issues are there, no doubt, but they missed how incredible the core experience actually is. The combat alone changes everything. You're not just attacking enemies, you're climbing onto massive creatures, holding on while they move, and fighting in a way that feels dynamic and unpredictable. It creates these moments that feel almost cinematic without trying too hard. Then there's the pawn system, which adds a really unique layer to the game. Having companions that learn from you and can even be shared with other players makes the journey feel more personal. Critics saw flaws, but in reality, this is one of those RPGs that rewards patience, and once it clicks, it becomes something truly memorable. Kingdom Come. Deliverance is one of those games that demands patience, and that's exactly why so many critics struggled with it at launch. It doesn't try to be a power fantasy at all. You start off as a nobody who can barely swing a sword properly, and even basic fights can go wrong if you're not careful. But that's what makes the progression feel so real. As you train, learn mechanics, and slowly improve, you genuinely feel like you're getting better alongside your character. The combat is very grounded and a bit tricky at first, with its directional system and timing, but once it clicks, it becomes incredibly satisfying. What really stands out, though, is the immersion. The world feels authentic, from the way people talk to how quests unfold without holding your hand. You're not just following markers, you're paying attention, figuring things out, and sometimes even failing, which adds to the realism. Critics focused on the bugs and steep learning curve, which were definitely there, but they missed how deep and rewarding the experience becomes if you stick with it. It's one of those games that doesn't try to please everyone, but for the right player, it hits on a completely different level. Not every RPG needs perfect shooting mechanics to be memorable, and that's exactly where Alpha Protocol got misunderstood. Critics mostly focused on its clunky combat and rough edges, and yeah, those issues are definitely there, but that's not what makes this game special. The real strength is in how reactive everything feels. Conversations aren't just static dialogue trees, they happen in real time. You're under pressure, and your choices actually shape relationships, missions, and even how the story plays out. It creates this feeling that you're genuinely influencing events instead of just following a script. The spy setting also gives it a different kind of tone, more grounded, more about decisions and consequences than just action. Critics saw a lack of polish, but in reality, it's one of the few RPGs where your choices truly matter in a meaningful way, and that makes it stand out even today. At a glance, this might look like just another military shooter, and that's exactly why Spec Ops The Line caught so many people off guard. Critics initially treated it as something generic, focusing on its basic gameplay, but that completely misses what the game is really doing. The deeper you go, the more it starts to challenge you in ways most shooters don't even attempt. This isn't about being the hero, it's about questioning your actions and dealing with the consequences. Moments like the white phosphorus scene don't just shock you, they stay with you, forcing you to think about what you've done instead of just moving on. The gameplay may feel familiar, but that's intentional. It pulls you in with something comfortable, then flips it into something much darker and more uncomfortable. Critics overlooked its impact at the time, but in reality, this is one of those rare games that uses its story to leave a lasting impression. And honestly, from here on, the list just keeps getting more interesting. Sometimes a game doesn't need a massive world or complex systems to leave an impact. It just needs strong characters and a meaningful journey, and that's exactly what Enslaved Odyssey to the West delivers. Critics at the time felt it was a bit too simple and linear, but that really overlooks where the game shines. The relationship between Monkey and Trip is the heart of the experience. It starts off tense and forced, but slowly grows into something genuine, and you actually feel that change as you play. The world around them also stands out, with these beautiful, overgrown environments that give the whole journey a unique and almost peaceful contrast to the danger. Gameplay-wise, it's straightforward, but smooth enough to keep you engaged without getting in the way of the story. Critics saw a lack of depth, but in reality, it's a focused, emotional adventure that sticks with you because of its characters more than anything else. What really grabs you here isn't the combat or the pacing, it's the idea at the center of everything, and that's exactly why Remember Me deserved more attention than it got. Critics mostly called it average because of repetitive gameplay, and yeah, the combat can feel a bit limited over time, but they kind of overlooked how creative the core concept actually is. The whole memory remix system is something you don't see often. You're literally going inside someone's memories and changing key moments, and then watching how that alters their behavior in the real world. It's such a cool idea, and when it works, it feels genuinely unique. The setting also adds a lot to the experience. Neo Paris has this distinct mix of futuristic tech and classic style that gives the game a strong identity. Critics focused on its flaws, but in reality, it's a game full of bold ideas that make it stand out, even if everything around those ideas isn't perfect. At first glance, it's easy to mistake this for just another third-person shooter, and that's exactly why Binary Domain didn't get the attention it deserved. Critics mostly treated it like a generic action game, pointing out that it didn't do anything revolutionary, but once you actually play it, there's a lot more going on. The combat feels way more satisfying than expected, especially with how enemies react. You're not just shooting them down, you're tearing robots apart piece by piece, blowing off limbs, exposing their internal systems, and watching them keep fighting in damaged states. It adds this intensity that keeps encounters fresh. What really makes it stand out, though, is the squad system. Your teammates react to your actions, and even your voice if you use commands, which makes the whole experience feel more interactive. Critics focused on what it lacked, but in reality, it delivers a surprisingly engaging mix of action and personality that a lot of shooters don't even try to achieve. And yeah, from here on, the list gets even stronger.
Apparently, the sea gate's gonna open to let the tanker in. Then we could hit.
Sometimes a game gets lost in comparisons, and that's exactly what happened here, because everyone kept putting it next to other big open-world titles instead of judging it on its own. That's why Sleeping Dogs didn't get the recognition it truly deserved from critics at the time. A lot of them said it felt like just another clone, but once you actually play it, it has its own identity. The combat alone sets it apart. Instead of relying heavily on guns, it focuses on hand-to-hand fighting with this brutal, fast-paced style that feels incredibly satisfying. Every punch, every counter, it all has weight to it. Then there's the setting. Hong Kong feels alive, colorful, and packed with detail in a way that makes exploring genuinely fun. The story also hits harder than expected, especially with the undercover cop angle that constantly puts you in morally complicated situations. Critics saw something familiar, but in reality, it's one of the most unique and engaging open-world experiences out there. Not every open-world game needs chaos and action to keep you hooked, and that's exactly what LA Noire proved, even though a lot of critics didn't fully appreciate it at the time. Many of them pointed out its slower pace and limited freedom compared to other games in the genre, but that completely misses what makes it special. This isn't about running wild through the city, it's about paying attention, thinking like a detective, and reading people carefully. Those interrogation scenes are where the game really shines. Watching subtle facial expressions, listening closely to what's being said, and deciding whether someone is lying or telling the truth creates a kind of tension that most games don't even attempt. The setting also adds a lot to the experience. That 1940s Los Angeles vibe feels authentic, from the cars to the music to the overall atmosphere. Critics focused on what it wasn't, but in reality, it delivers a unique and immersive detective experience that still feels fresh even today. Sometimes a game gets remembered more for its repetition than for everything it actually does right. And that's exactly what happened with Mafia III. Critics were quick to point out the repetitive mission structure, and yeah, that criticism is fair to a degree, but it ended up overshadowing one of the strongest parts of the game. The story here hits hard. Playing as Lincoln Clay, you're not just going through another crime story, you're experiencing a personal revenge journey that feels raw and grounded. The way the narrative is presented, almost like a documentary with interviews and flashbacks, adds a level of depth that a lot of open-world games don't even try. The setting of New Bordeaux also stands out, with its music, atmosphere, and attention to detail making the world feel alive in its own way. Critics focused heavily on the repetition, but in reality, the emotional weight and storytelling carry the experience much further than expected. Sometimes a game gets judged before people even give it a fair shot, and that's exactly what happened with Mass Effect. Andromeda. Critics and players alike focused heavily on its rough launch, especially the facial animations and bugs. And yeah, those issues were real, but they ended up defining the entire conversation around the game. What got overlooked is how fun it actually feels to play. The combat is easily one of the best in the series, with smooth movement, jetpack mobility, and the freedom to mix different abilities however you want. It makes every fight feel dynamic instead of static. Exploration also plays a bigger role here, with different planets to discover, each offering its own challenges and environments. It gives you that sense of being part of a new frontier, even if the story doesn't always hit the same emotional highs as the original trilogy. Critics focused on what it didn't live up to, but in reality, there's a solid and enjoyable RPG here that's worth experiencing if you go in with the right expectations. Sometimes expectations can do more damage than the game itself, and that's exactly what happened here when Watch Dogs first came out. Critics and players were expecting something revolutionary based on early previews, and when it didn't fully match that vision, it got labeled as a disappointment. But if you step back and play it on its own terms, there's actually a lot to like. The whole idea of controlling a city through hacking still feels fresh. You're not just running and shooting, you're manipulating traffic lights, accessing cameras, and planning situations in a more strategic way. Chicago as a setting also has this grounded, slightly gritty feel that fits the story well. Aiden Pierce isn't your typical flashy protagonist either. He's more quiet and focused, which some people didn't connect with, but it actually works for the tone. Critics focused on what was promised versus what was delivered, but in reality, it's a unique open-world experience that becomes way more enjoyable once you stop comparing it to expectations.
Leave it, it's fine.
It's fine. He thinks he can get inside.
How do you know what he thinks?
You're checking the locks.
Look, I can handle this on my own. We do not...
Sometimes a game gets stuck with its launch reputation and never fully escapes it, and that's exactly what happened with Assassin's Creed Unity. Critics at release focused heavily on the bugs, glitches, and performance issues, and honestly, that criticism was completely fair at the time. But what got overlooked is how much the game improved and how strong the core experience actually is. Once you play it now, the first thing that stands out is Paris. The city feels alive in a way that very few open-world games manage, with dense crowds, detailed streets, and interiors you can actually explore. Movement is another highlight. The parkour system gives you a level of control that feels smooth once you get used to it, making traversal genuinely fun. Stealth also feels more focused, rewarding patience instead of forcing combat. Critics locked in their opinions early, but in reality, this is one of the most immersive entries in the series if you give it a proper chance. Sometimes a game gets overlooked simply because it tries to do too much at once, and that's exactly what happened with Darksiders II. Critics at the time felt like it was pulling from too many genres without fully committing to one, but that's also what makes it so enjoyable. Instead of sticking to a single formula, it mixes fast-paced hack-and-slash combat with dungeon puzzles, platforming, and even RPG-style loot systems, and somehow it all comes together in a really satisfying way. Playing as Death gives the game a completely different feel too. He's quicker, more agile, and the combat flows smoothly when you start chaining attacks together. The world design also stands out, with these large, stylized environments that feel almost like something out of a dark fantasy comic. Critics focused on the lack of focus, but in reality, that variety keeps the experience fresh from start to finish. And yeah, we're getting close to the final stretch, and the last few games are seriously worth it. Sometimes a game gets dismissed just because it doesn't take itself seriously, and that's exactly what happened with Bulletstorm. Critics at the time brushed it off as over-the-top and lacking depth, but that completely misses the point of what makes it so fun. This game is all about style and creativity. Instead of playing like a standard shooter, it pushes you to experiment, to chain crazy moves together, and to take down enemies in the most ridiculous ways possible. The skill shot system is where everything clicks. You're not just shooting, you're pulling enemies in, kicking them into hazards, launching them into the air, and finishing them off in ways that feel unique every time. It turns combat into this kind of playground where you're constantly trying to outdo yourself. The humor is loud and not for everyone, but if it clicks, it adds to the energy of the whole experience. Critics focused on its lack of seriousness, but in reality, it's one of the few shooters that actually dares to be different and have fun with its own mechanics.
Let's web out. I'll go low, you guard high. No surprises that way.
Sometimes a game feels rough around the edges on purpose, and that's exactly where The Evil Within got misunderstood. Critics pointed out its technical issues and uneven pacing, and yeah, those problems are there, but they missed what the game was really going for. This isn't meant to be a smooth, comfortable horror experience. It throws you into situations where you feel underpowered, low on resources, and constantly on edge. Every encounter forces you to think, whether that means setting traps, conserving ammo, or just running when things get out of control. That pressure creates a kind of tension a lot of modern horror games don't have. The environments also keep shifting in unpredictable ways, almost like you're stuck inside a nightmare that never fully makes sense. Critics focused on its flaws, but in reality, it delivers a raw and intense survival horror experience that sticks with you because it refuses to play it safe. Sometimes a game doesn't need a huge budget or massive world to hit hard, and that's exactly what makes Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, stand out. Critics did praise it, but at the same time, a lot of people overlooked just how powerful the experience actually is because it looks smaller on the surface. The moment you start playing, you're pulled straight into Senua's mind in a way that feels personal and honestly a bit unsettling. Those voices you hear aren't just background noise, they react, they guide you, and sometimes they make things even more confusing. It creates this constant tension that never really goes away. Combat is simple, but it feels heavy and grounded, like every fight matters instead of just being filler. The puzzles also tie into how Senua sees the world, which makes everything feel connected to her perspective. Critics appreciated parts of it, but in reality, this is one of those rare games that stays with you long after you finish it because of how deeply it connects with you. Sometimes a game doesn't try to impress you right away, and that's exactly why Outward got such mixed reactions when it launched. Critics pointed out its clunky combat and lack of guidance, and yeah, that can be frustrating at first, but that's also what makes it feel so different. You're not some chosen hero here, you're just a regular person trying to survive, and the game treats you like it. You have to manage hunger, sleep, weather, and even basic travel, which turns simple journeys into actual adventures. Every decision matters because there are real consequences if you're not prepared. The combat takes time to understand, but once it clicks, it becomes more about planning and timing than just quick reactions. Critics focused on how rough it felt, but in reality, it delivers a deep and rewarding experience for players who are willing to slow down and adapt to its pace. Sometimes a game gets overlooked simply because it doesn't come from a huge studio, and that's exactly what happened with GreedFall. Critics pointed out its repetition and smaller scale, and yeah, you can feel the budget limitations at times, but that also made people miss what it actually does really well. The moment you arrive on the island, there's this strong sense of mystery and discovery that keeps pulling you forward. It's not just about fighting enemies, it's about navigating politics, building relationships with different factions, and making choices that actually shape how things play out. The combat might feel familiar, but the freedom to build your character in different ways, mixing magic, melee, and firearms, keeps things interesting. Critics focused on what it lacked compared to bigger RPGs, but in reality, it's a focused and engaging experience that stands out because of its atmosphere and choice-driven storytelling. And yeah, we're almost at the end, but the last few picks are definitely worth sticking around for. Sometimes a game stands out for its style more than anything else, and that's exactly what made the Saboteur so unique. even though a lot of critics didn't fully appreciate it at the time. Many of them treated it like just another open-world title, but that completely overlooks what gives it its identity. The black and white visual style, where color slowly returns as you liberate areas, isn't just a cool effect. It actually makes you feel like you're bringing life back into the world. It adds a sense of progress that you can literally see. Gameplay-wise, it blends stealth, climbing, and open-world chaos in a way that feels familiar but still fun. You can approach missions however you want, sneaking through enemy territory or going loud and causing destruction. Critics focused on its similarities to other games, but in reality, it's a creative and memorable experience that dares to do something different.
The barman's talking to the police. I'll take care of Veronique. You boy, get out of here. Jules, time to get scared.
Sometimes a game gets overlooked just because it's a bit too loud and different for its own good, and that's exactly what happened with Sunset Overdrive. Critics were a bit mixed on its humor and over-the-top style, saying it could feel chaotic or even annoying at times, but that really misses what makes it so fun. The moment you start moving around the city, everything clicks. You're not meant to walk or play it safe. You're grinding on rails, bouncing off walls, and chaining movement together in a way that feels fast and incredibly satisfying. Combat is built around that movement too, pushing you to stay in motion instead of hiding behind cover. The more creative you get, the more fun it becomes. Critics focused on its tone, but in reality, it's one of the few open-world games that fully commits to its style and rewards you for embracing it. Sometimes a game becomes more interesting the moment you realize your choices actually have consequences, and that's exactly where Vampyr stands out. Critics pointed out its stiff combat and technical limitations, and yeah, those issues are there, but they ended up overshadowing what makes the game special. This isn't just about fighting enemies, it's about deciding who lives and who doesn't. Every citizen in the city has a story, relationships, and a role in the world, and if you choose to feed on them, it directly affects the balance of entire districts. That creates this constant tension between becoming stronger and holding on to your humanity. The atmosphere also plays a huge role. The dark, foggy streets and quiet tone give the game this melancholic feel that pulls you in over time. Critics focused on its flaws, but in reality, it offers a unique and meaningful choice system that makes every decision feel important. Sometimes a game doesn't need to be loud or action-packed to leave a lasting impact, and that's exactly what makes A Plague Tale: Innocence so special. Critics did appreciate parts of it, but a lot of people still overlooked how powerful the experience actually is. From the moment the story begins, you feel that constant pressure of survival, not just for yourself, but for someone else. Protecting Hugo changes everything. Every decision feels heavier because you're not just thinking about getting through, you're thinking about keeping him safe. The gameplay leans into stealth and problem-solving, especially with the way light is used to control those massive swarms of rats, which creates this unique kind of tension. One small mistake can turn a quiet moment into pure panic. What really stands out, though, is the relationship between the siblings. It feels natural, it grows over time, and by the end, you're genuinely attached to their journey. Critics saw a smaller-scale experience, but in reality, it's a deeply emotional story that stays with you long after it's over.
Well, we got out.
So we can leave now, right?
If they don't find us again.
But you have your sling. You can protect us.
And that's the thing with all these games. Sometimes reviews don't tell the full story. Sometimes a game just needs the right mindset or a bit of patience to really click. So now I'm curious. Which of these games did you actually enjoy even when everyone else was hating on it? Or maybe there's a hidden gem you think deserved to be on this list. Drop it in the comments, I'll definitely check it out. And if you enjoyed this kind of video, stick around, because there are always more underrated games out there waiting to be discovered.